So this is an archival web video where I capture the cold versus flu webpage at the Centers for Disease Control on April 16th, 2020. And this is a companion video to my article, Uncounted COVID Deaths, the CDC's Contradictory Pneumonia and Influenza Death Numbers. So in researching the coronavirus COVID-19 pandemic, I discovered to my astonishment that the Centers for Disease Control appears to be using two radically different numbers for the number of annual deaths from uh, influenza and pneumonia, or what is also called pneumonia and influenza, which in common usage you would expect to refer to the same thing. So in the leading causes of death from 2017, the most recent year for which there are reports, about 55,000 people are reported to have died from influenza and pneumonia, which is ranked 8th among the leading causes of death. However, if you look at the CDC's weekly influenza and pneumonia death statistics as of April 15th, yesterday, as of when I wrote the article, you will find they have a file, a comma-separated values file, which is called nchsdata14.csv. It's updated each week with the weekly number. And that file has data supposedly going back way before 2017 to late 2013. If you sum the weekly deaths for pneumonia and influenza in that file for 2017, you get over 188,000 deaths, over 3 times the number of the leading causes. And in fact, you typically will hear on the radio a number, or on the news, a number of about 55,000 for the number of deaths from flu or flu-associated illness or influenza and pneumonia. They use several different terms that seem to refer to the same thing at times. When I look deeper into this, in the weekly statistics, influenza, which is what the CDC at times says it means by flu, influenza is a specific category of virus, and influenza is almost never listed as a cause of death. It's usually pneumonia. This leads kind of down a rabbit hole where it appears that the influenza and pneumonia number in the leading causes of death is probably the product of a mathematical model attributing many pneumonia deaths to an initiating flu infection or something like that. So the CDC claims that the flu is rarely diagnosed. It's grossly underdiagnosed because doctors apparently almost never put it on death certificates, and this has been going on for a very long time. They've been claiming this as far back at least as 2005. So an obvious issue is, well, can you tell apart a cold versus a flu, at least a reasonable amount of the time? And this is the web page where they compare the cold versus the flu. And they say, what is the difference between a cold and a flu? And they say what at best could be described as contradictory things about a flu and a cold. And the thing I drew attention to in my article is this graphic here, which seems to imply that you can probably tell them apart a significant amount of time, let's say 80% of the time or more. They don't use a number, and it's not a quantitative chart, but it certainly implies that if a doctor interviews their patient, perhaps takes their temperature, does a few easy physical checks without a molecular biology test for the flu, which supposedly doesn't work very well, which is their explanation for some of this. So here it is. Is it a cold or flu? And so we have signs and symptoms. We have cold versus flu. Symptom onset is described as gradual for a cold and abrupt for a flu, which sounds rather different. Now, they don't give the hours that this refers to, but most people reading this would assume it's kind of different. Fever is rare in a cold, usual in a flu. So usually fever means a high temperature, so you take the patient's temperature and you say, this guy's hot. This person has got body temperature pretty close. Aches, slight, usual in a flu. That's probably a subjective thing where you have to ask the patient how they feel. Fatigue and weakness, sometimes in a cold, usual in a flu. Sneezing, common sometimes. And down at headaches, they say headaches are rare, and in a cold it's rare, and flu it's common. Now, they don't give numbers for any of this, but if you were looking at that, you would expect that doctors can ask a question about each of these symptoms, get a list, and say that looks an awful lot like a flu. And in some cases, like the fever, and probably some others, Um, they could take your temperature and do some actual objective tests as well that don't require sophisticated biochemical, molecular biology type tests that, according to what they say here, is special tests that usually must be done within the first few days of illness can tell if a person has the flu. Okay, that may be true. It sounds hard to believe, right? But if you're sick with the flu, it's doing all kinds of things to your biology. There are large numbers of influenza viruses reproducing in your body, correct? Producing something. They are specific proteins that should comprise the protective covering of the virus. So these things are not present after a couple of days of being sick, right? If somebody's wheeled into the emergency room and they've got a bad infection, right? Why would it disappear? Okay, that's very hard to believe, but okay, let's accept that for the sake of argument. Um, Still, this chart seems to imply a considerable difference, as does some of the other language here that could be detected by a doctor without a test. And in addition, they say colds generally do not result in serious health problems. Okay, so in their world, the common cold never kills 65-year-olds, but influenza kills 65-year-olds. And remember, most people have really serious problems and die from respiratory illnesses are elderly. They have other health issues. They may be diabetic. They may have other things. So you would think that a doctor would be pretty concerned in an elderly patient who in fact ends up dying, that they would order the tests where they're not sure, or even when they're sure, they say, well, hey, this might be the flu. I better check. I better cover myself. I better do my job right. And similarly, this table strongly implies that in probably a large percentage of the cases, a verbal, talking to the patient the way doctors are supposed to. They're supposed to do a interview of you to determine what's happened and what's going on. And in addition, there are some things like taking your temperature that they can do. If fever doesn't mean high temperature, what's it doing there? Is it like you feel like you have a fever? Okay. Down here they have these. And like many of the CDC websites, it does not provide links, which it could easily do, footnotes and links to, let's go down that rabbit hole, peer-reviewed scholarly literature, medical journals and other things and articles backing up these statements. And of course, many people want to make informed decisions. And of course, doctors, who very likely come to these websites too, probably would like that information, but there's nothing like that here. Has a couple other things, like something to do with the flu and vaccine coverage. There we go. Usual stuff. So, and more on influenza. So this is the reason I'm collecting this is I want to kind of back up what I said in my article and keep a copy of what the website looked like at the time that I published my article, in case it changes. My guess is it's going to change because people are going to ask these questions, and they should, of the CDC, and we may see some interesting changes. So let me kind of wrap it up here and say this is a companion again to my Uncounted COVID Deaths, the CDC's Contradictory Pneumonia and Influenza death numbers. And I will add my usual professional disclaimer. I'm not a doctor. I don't claim to be. I don't do that kind of thing. If you have medical issues or any issues that require a qualified professional, especially a licensed one like a medical doctor, that's who you should talk to. This information is for educational, informational purposes only. It's a starting point. You need to make your own decisions and talk to people who are familiar with, for example, respiratory illnesses, which can be quite dangerous, as the death numbers indicate. And I personally had a case where I had a mysterious respiratory illness several years ago and went to the emergency room, and it's possible that going to the emergency room saved my life. But obviously I was treated by qualified medical professionals who did various things, and I'm certainly not honing in on their territory or anything like that. I think you should definitely do that. So please be careful, and I hope we will come through this global crisis as well as can be and minimize deaths. But I think people really should question these various, both the language and the numbers on the CDC website. It's just astonishing that you have these two numbers, 55,000 deaths in one place and 188,000 in another. And that concludes this archival web video. This concludes this video presentation. If you like this video, please click like. Please click subscribe and the notification bell if you would like to receive more content from us. You can avoid internet censorship by subscribing directly to our RSS news feed. Please consider sharing the link by email or on your website or blog, in addition to liking, upvoting, or sharing on increasingly censored, advertising beholden, and big company social media. We have encountered such censorship. Mathematical Software is developing software to automate data analysis, reducing the risks of costly errors and improving results. You can support our work financially by subscribing on our Patreon page. Scan the QR code in the lower right corner to get the Patreon link. Our Patreon link is also in the show notes below.